International Media TV. Television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
So I am here with Timothy, one of the co-founders of the Oakland Book Festival. What's your take? How are you feeling it's going so far?
Feeling great. It's thrilling. The rooms are packed. Conversations are going on. There are performances here on the amphitheater. Tons of people here. It's a beautiful day. People seem to be having a good time and very well engaged.
Yes.
How are you feeling?
Feeling fantastic. Feeling the energy of all of the folks and all the speakers. You know, I'm curious, as you're, the organizer, the co-founder, what are you most excited about?
Which panels or
Yes.
the overall thing? Well, there's a panel going on right now, which I'm missing, called Utopian Thought Today, about the history of utopian thought in the 19th century, in the radical 60s, and where we're at today. Whether the possibility of utopia, belief in utopia is still possible. There's also a panel going on right now between Mary Roach and Jacob Ward in council chambers. That's quite thrilling. Mary's just written a book called Grunt, The Curious Science of Humans at War, and it's about the labor of soldiering. So we have two panels going on right now that come at things from a totally different perspective, but they're both about labor. One about utopian thought and labor movements, and how labor movements tie into, utopian capacities, and the other about war. And the attempts by scientists and technologists to make soldiers immune to panic, fear, and pain. So we've got a huge, broad thing happening right now, and it's gorgeous. The plaza's full. It's a beautiful day. We're really happy. It's thrilling.
Truly. Well, a wonderful spectrum of ideas, authors, concepts are being shared here at the Oakland Book Festival. And just thank you for bringing that vision to form.
Nothing at all. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Oh, good afternoon. We don't have too much time, so we're just going to jump right into it, fellas. Okay. In Malcolm X's last recorded speech, he spoke about the need to elevate the struggle for civil rights to one of an international human rights question. In fact, he described the civil rights struggle to quote, "You're taking your case to the criminal. You're taking your case to the person who created the problem. You need to take the criminal to court," by which he meant International Court of Human Rights, the United Nations. In terms of Malcolm's legacy, where do we stand with this articulation today? Does the civil rights struggle necessarily need to be elevated to a human rights struggle in order to succeed in gaining the rights of blacks in America to participate fully?
Pleasure to be here. Malcolm decided that he would not be bound by the borders of the nation state, that he would not be bound by the borders that were drawn around him, and he took his struggle to the international level. His plan was to take the United States and hold it accountable in the international arena and international institutions, the African Union, what was called the Organization of African Unity, and the United Nations, right? My interest, my work, I'm interested in the impact of Malcolm X around the world globally, right? Malcolm dies in 1965. After his death, we get the Black Power movement inspired by Malcolm. We get Stokely Carmichael, sort of tracing Malcolm's steps internationally, also taking the black struggle to the international level. My interest is the other movements in other countries who were inspired by Malcolm, right? So after Malcolm's death, you get the Black Power movement in England with Michael X. Then you get the Black Panther movement in Israel, right? North African Jews launching a movement in 1971. Then you get the Polynesian Black Panthers in New Zealand, 1971 as well. Then you get the Dalits, right, in South India, also launching a Black Panther movement. So this was Malcolm's impact in the 1960s. I see over there you have the Marable book, Justin. Marable argues that Che Guevara was one of the first to be inspired by Malcolm X, right? So this was his impact. This is the first birth, the first coming of Malcolm in the 1960s, right? 60s into the mid-70s. And then Malcolm X sort of fades, right? You get a reference to him in a song by Billy Paul, 1976, Let Him In. And then in the book that you wrote, Making Malcolm, we have the second coming of Malcolm X in the early 90s, right? And he is resurrected, revived by hip-hop, right? Starting in the early 80s, Keith LeBlanc. Then you get Poor Righteous Teachers, Gangstar, Guru, Rakim, and so on. And then you get the Malcolm Mania sparked by Spike Lee's film, and so forth. And then Malcolm again sort of fades once hip-hop goes commercial, goes global in the late 90s. My interest is in the third coming, or the third resurrection of Malcolm X, right? Which is how Malcolm today is inspiring movements and being appropriated, being adapted, right, by movements, Afro-Latino movements primarily, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Cuba, right? Second, the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. Every time there is some sort of a democratic experiment, political liberalization in North Africa and the Middle East, as it happened with the so-called Arab Spring, Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X, becomes a bestseller, right? Along with Che Guevara, right? Revolutionary texts,
That's right?
But the region, and this is the piece that you circulated, the region, I think, where you see the most, sort of the most influence of Malcolm, the most love for Malcolm X today is Europe, right? Among black and Muslim communities. Over the last decade, with the launching of the war on terror, with the rise of surveillance states, with the rise of these right-wing, the nativist surge that you're seeing in Europe, you're getting these communities that are ghetto-bound, right? Muslim communities, African communities. And we have seen in the last decade the launching of the Greek Black Panthers, right, in Athens to counter Golden Dawn. We've seen Pantararna in Sweden, the Swedish Black Panthers. We've seen the new Black Panthers in Paris, the natives of the Republic, a political party launched in Paris called Les Indigènes de la République in French, right? And they are all inspired by Malcolm X, right? So his impact overseas is extraordinary. One of the questions I ask is, why is Malcolm nowadays more influential overseas than domestically? One of the questions I raise is, over the last few years, last couple of years, we've seen a restoration of James Baldwin in the U.S., right? Ta-Nehisi's book.
That's right.
But you haven't seen sort of, the revival of Malcolm X domestically. Why is that? What I argue is that Malcolm, in some ways, interest in Malcolm is a geopolitical bellwether. Once your minorities gain an interest in Malcolm, it means they are developing a race consciousness, right? Images, sort of the graffiti, the profile, the visage of Malcolm tends to appear in the urban peripheries, right? The favelas of Sao Paulo, the barrios of Bogota, banlieues of Paris, right? What is it about this figure that electrifies the marginalized? Right? What is it about him that inspires and leads young people from? I mean, every year I go up to to Ferncrest Cemetery up in Hartsdale in New York, where Malcolm is buried. Right, May 19th, May 20th is his birthday celebration. Since 1965, there's an annual pilgrimage from Harlem. Right, people go up and there's a ceremony. Buses leave from Harlem from 125th Street, and every year you're seeing the crowd, the pilgrimage grow and change, drawing people from around the world, right? You see people from Australia, you're seeing people from Brazil, and so on, right? This figure so epitomizes black internationalism. He epitomizes the ability to transcend the nation state, and so much more. But that's sort of my opening remark.
Let me see your book. Okay. So, I want to tell you all to pick this book up, Rebel Music, Race, Empire, and the New Muslim Youth Culture, because Professor Hisham, my former student, who's now outstripped me, and, done such brilliant work. This book is a powerful and tangible testimony to the incredible fertility, not only of his intellectual imagination and his scholarly vision, but taking measure, as you've just briefly heard, of Malcolm X's influence the world over. And we cannot but help, I think, take note of at least the paradox that Malcolm is most especially embraced at the heart of European colonialism, right? Because the battle is more pitched, more explicit, and as Hisham just said, the way in which Malcolm becomes the bellwether to test the durability of the emerging consciousness, racially speaking, in societies where an available language of race is questionable. So that Malcolm becomes shorthand for an immediate access to a complicated analysis that is nonetheless lucid of the stakes of colonial and imperial logics deployed against the bodies of brown, black, and peoples of color throughout the world. And so I think it's especially gratifying that Malcolm X becomes such not only a benchmark and bellwether internationally, especially in Europe, but also the way in which the suppressed premise of Malcolm's presence in America. You know, when we look at logic and we look at the suppressed premise, it's the one that operates powerfully but is often not seen explicitly. And so in the kind of dyadic thinking of Malcolm versus Martin, and I think about the new book, of course, of Malcolm and Muhammad Ali. Was it Blood Brothers?
That's the one.
And the degree to which Malcolm continues to resonate on this side of the pond and within American culture in an interesting inferential way. The most prominent recent articulation of Malcolm X is by Beyonce. Now, right, on the Lemonade video, right, where Malcolm X is making an argument inscribed into the burgeoning feminist consciousness of a global icon, a contested global icon, who's resurrecting a certain kind of blackness within America that can be legitimated. So not only in Europe, where colonial powers and imperialist logic is being contested, and Malcolm provides a ready access to the lucid articulation of resistance, but now in America, belatedly some would argue, during Black Lives Matter protests and the iconic struggle over the appropriation of Black Panther paraphernalia, and to some degree a concomitant ideological strike at the heart of white supremacy, a figure like Beyonce accesses Malcolm to make a defense of black female identity. Wow. That's a complicated and interesting thing, given what Hisham knows is the rather complicated emergence and development, evolution I should say, and development of Malcolm's ideas about women to begin with. So for me, it's striking and interesting and engaging, and I think that Malcolm X possesses what literary scholars call a literary future. That there's a constant fertility, a relentless interrogation of what he might mean, because he is relentlessly and unfailingly interesting, because no matter where you situate him, he speaks to us from informed margins. And he speaks to us about revolutionary potentials for transformation in ways that are immediately accessible to people, because the stakes are very clear. The bodies, the minds, the spirits, and the institutions that have been produced within these minority cultures certainly not only are at stake, but become the means by which a counter-dominant narrative is put forth, and Malcolm becomes the shining star for that in a very interesting way. And the difference between when Hisham speaks about the pilgrimages to his gravesite, and the way in which, again, he accumulates capital in this culture in yet a third iteration, in a kind of post-Obama culture, where you remember the brouhaha occasion not too long ago because of the link between the conservative side of his ideological infrastructure, so to speak, when you had a Clarence Thomas who was saying he read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and people began to, in one sense, engage in an analysis about the parallels between the two, and certainly they exist, but the reasonably and radically dissimilar consequences to which those to which those conclusions can be put. Because what Clarence Thomas thinks and what Malcolm X thinks is two different things. So I think that Malcolm remains resonant because he remains relevant, because his analysis of the fundamental means by which white supremacy dominates black and peoples of color consciousness has been reissued. When Hisham spoke about Ta-Nehisi and the revival of James Baldwin, it's also to revive Baldwin is to revive to a certain degree, Malcolm as well, because James Baldwin at his most ferocious is under the inspiration of a certain kind of black nationalist identity that is being articulated over against the abrogating integrationist ideals that have not supplied the power and the insight that James Baldwin is reaching for, even though he's critical on both sides. A revival of Baldwin inevitably represents a revival of a certain element of Malcolm and what he means to those revolutionary struggles, especially in a time where, again, the argument has to be made that in this case Black lives matter, but across the world that the lives of those who were poor and vulnerable matter as well.
I'd like to return to the international scope of the third iteration as the two of you described it. At the beginning of this conversation, I spoke of Malcolm's last recorded speech in which he talked about abandoning the civil rights struggle for an international human rights struggle. As part of this same analysis, he was urging blacks in America to unite with Africans and join in their struggle against colonialism. So here in the present day, in this third iteration as the two of you described it, there is a extremely high contrast, isn't there, between how Malcolm is articulated internationally and how he is understood here in the United States. I'm thinking in particular of the fact that as the Reagan-Bush junta in American politics continued to extend itself into the 21st century, in the waning months of Bush-Cheney, we saw the development of AFRICOM, the African Military Command, and it is a fact that over the last 7 years, the United States has extended its military power throughout the continent of Africa at an unprecedented level. So is there something that here in the United States that is missing, some key element from our understanding of Malcolm that prevents us from following the message of elevating to the human rights level of an international struggle or finding common grounds with the African anti-colonial struggles that are taking place today?
Man, your questions. Use the word message. And Professor, you mentioned Beyonce. Got me thinking of it. I was recently in Paris. I'm a little jet lagged. Right? I was doing some interviews in the banlieue. And I put up on Facebook a graffiti that I saw, right? Sort of, this is a slogan or an expression you're seeing, even a hashtag. You've seen it on T-shirts, and it says, Liberté, Égalité, Beyoncé. Right? Beyoncé represents liberation. Beyoncé represents a certain uplift, right? That's, you know, that's what a number of these young activists are saying. And it got me thinking about a piece that Du Bois wrote in 1915, The Negro. Right, where he says African Americans have a conception of liberty, right? A conception of liberty that is going to rival the Greek and French conception of liberty, and is going to be disseminated, broadcast around the world through art, through the Negro's magnificent impulse for art, right? So I think of the role of music in disseminating the Black freedom message, right? The role of music, whether it's jazz in the beginning, or and now hip-hop, and disseminating Malcolm's message. And what is that message, right, according to Du Bois and so on? Well, it's anti-racism, it's anti-imperialism, it's solidarity. That message disturbs the establishment, it disturbs policymakers, right? People are deeply ambivalent about the autobiography of Malcolm X. Right? On the one hand, some people see it as a humanizing text. It is assigned in colleges and so forth. Others see it as a radicalizing text. It can make you anti-American. Do not forget, not too far from here, I think it was October 2001, maybe November 2001, Shelby Steele was on C-SPAN holding up a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X, saying this is the text that produces extremists, right? He was referring to the case of John Walker Lynn, remember? A young man, a young European American who was found in Afghanistan behind enemy lines and so on. And people started asking, how did he become an extremist? How did he join the enemy and so forth, right? So they looked at, he was blogging online and so on. And they said, well, at the age of 12, his mother took him to see the biopic, the Spike Lee film, right? That introduced him to hip-hop, right? And that sort of was his gateway into radicalism, right? And he would pose online, he'd pose as black, he was Professor X, he was Professor this and so on. So he had an entire conversation, right, that emerged in 2002 about the radicalizing or potentially politicizing influence of Malcolm X. And then you hear government, you hear policymakers talking about the need for a moderate hip-hop and for a moderate understanding of Malcolm, right? So there's a deep ambivalence, right? So an understanding of Malcolm that leads to a critique of AFRICOM, you're going to get that overseas. Over here, you'll get it, obviously, you'll get it in Oakland, you'll get it on the margins.
You get it right now.
You get it right now, but you're not going to see it on CBS or NBC and so on, right? It's a different understanding of Malcolm.
Michael, where do you see that? Is there a structural flaw, if you will, here in the United States in terms of getting to the message of Malcolm's internationalism? I mean, where is it that we're not connecting with what Hisham is describing in terms of that not just popularity but embrace of Malcolm's philosophy, particularly in his later years and having traveled through the continent of Africa and Europe? Why so much embrace outside of the United States and less so here internally?
No, I think Hisham's, look, the analysis is powerful, it's brilliant, it's powerfully insightful as well. About the popular cultural mechanisms that distribute political intensities and registers, right? Because we like to, in our own condescension, even sneer at Beyonce, right? Oh, of course. We know that she's read bell hooks, right? In terms of some of the very legitimate critiques, but that liberté, égalité, Beyonce suggests that while we are here at the crib, sneering, the very people we want to forward solidarity with are drinking lemonade. And so what we also have to take into account, it seems to me, is the not small role that Obama plays in all this, because Obama became, for some, a cipher, but for others, a black hole to absorb all the, right? A black hole to absorb all of the useful and usable black energy directed toward injustice. Right? Been there, done black, used it on that, exhausted the capacity of black people to resist, especially when Obama becomes par excellence the representative of the state. Now you've got an essential contradiction that the very embodiment of the state is in the face of a black man. And that American empire runs roughshod throughout the world with the imprimatur of the presidential office, whose insignia is cast in black blood. AFRICOM's expansion, as you indicated for the last 7 years, ain't been going on under Bush.
That's right. That's right? Exactly right.
So the competition with China to corral Africa is not simply an economic one, but to use the newfound oil in certain regions to exploit as a displaced Middle East, number one, and number two, to look at those coastlines to facilitate American military presence.
That's exactly right.
So, under a black figure. And so now there's a kind of fracturing of the collective racial ego deposited in the body of black thought, where we have to disaggregate, so to speak, the data of black identity from its empirical embodiment in a figure like Obama. Obama represents both a political and an ontological question there. And how do we confront both at the same time? You know, if Baldwin says that blackness and whiteness is a political identity, right? That means, therefore, that we are struggling with the ways in which Malcolm's meaning is both grafted onto movements that may ultimately be contradicted by his commitment to a certain radical politics, but at the same time, the mechanisms that distribute his meaning and memory have been more effectively articulated within those very arenas. But to link that back to your question about why the absence of Malcolm's internationalism in terms of our awareness here is because of the encroaching Americanism that was encouraged in terms of black pride with the rise of the first black president. And one of the costs of that presidency has been the loss of a black internationalism that was critical of America in view of and in light of international practices that judged American failures morally and politically.
Right.
But now in the face of America again is black and some black people for the first time, I used to joke, I said, well, I had to go out and learn the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, it was a joke, but I think. When now the absorption of black radical energy by both Obama himself in claims of progressivism and various defenders in terms of what he opens up means that there's a conundrum unleashed and a problem for those who would make on-the-ground political analyses that remain radical, rooted in the contingencies and histories of what goes on in Paris or what goes on in Salvador de Bahia or, for that matter, Santiago de Cuba, and the international aspects of blackness and how that blackness gets melted down to practices that can be observed through measures of pop culture where that blackness is identified with. That's what I take the liberté, égalité, Beyonce. That's a rather interesting and powerful moment that opens up some very interesting possibilities as well as forecloses others. And I think Malcolm X functions in a certain way. The more distant we are on Malcolm's life, he becomes a kind of cipher for so many who can absorb him, and yet a useful metaphor for those who can use him in powerful fashion. Speaking of Professor Manning's book, you know, that book also threw a wrench into the interpretive mechanisms and uses of Malcolm,
Indeed.
Which I think are edifying and productive, even as they are problematic for many. And that can serve as a kind of metaphor for the ongoing engagement with Malcolm in a way that's always more complicated, more fluid, and more dynamic than the kind of reductive practices that see Malcolm as meaning only one thing to one group of people in one specific time and place, if that makes sense.
To emphasize in part the point that you're making in respect to Obama absorbing those energies, I would just remind all of us that in Colin Powell's endorsement of Barack Obama, his very lengthy endorsement of Barack Obama, he explained that he thought that this would be a very useful face to put on American foreign policy. This was also the argument that was made by Andrew Sullivan in his piece in The Atlantic. But to get back to Malcolm X, if I could introduce a paradox which is discussed in the piece that you wrote for The New Yorker, Hisham, and that has to do also with several points that you just made as well, Michael, and that is the use and misuse of Malcolm's image and message by the State Department in its propagandist efforts in the Mideast or in Yemen in particular. Could you share with the audience some of what you discovered about that?
One of the great ironies of sort of how Malcolm has been interpreted and adapted today is that in the 1960s he was traveling throughout Africa, and he was fearful that he would not be allowed to return to the U.S. He went to renew his passport. He thought they'd have his passport confiscated. He confides this to Maya Angelou, right? So he's traveling, but he's being surveilled and monitored and hounded and so on, right? And I spoke to a couple of diplomats. I spoke to Richard Murphy, right, who was he was stationed in Southern Africa, and he was stationed in Saudi Arabia. He's in his 80s now, right? And he said we had a problem, right? Malcolm traveling around the world, traveling from Ghana to Kenya and so on, and the positive press that he was receiving was a problem for us, right? And so they would launch an entire cultural diplomacy initiative, right? Spearheaded by Ralph Bunche, right, to counter this, right? And if you look at the conversations between Ralph Bunche and Malcolm and Bayard Rustin, right? Bunche and Rustin are very critical of Malcolm, right? You do not criticize your country overseas, right? It sets back the struggle here, right? Ralph Bunche would say it is the role of African Americans, as you mentioned, Colin Powell's quote. Ralph Bunche would say that African Americans have a particular capacity to gain the support of natives around the world.
That's right.
Right? So back in the 60s, there was an effort to neutralize Malcolm's radical critique of U.S. foreign policy. Today, it is extraordinary, right? Malcolm, black protest, black cultural protest, blackness in general is at the heart of U.S. soft power, right? I've been sort of looking at sort of documents released by the State Department, but also events everywhere from the embassy in Bolivia to Nigeria to Indonesia. Every Black History Month, there's a celebration of Malcolm, right? This is when he dies in February, so there's a celebration of Malcolm and Obama, right? It is Malcolm who made Obama possible. Right? And there's an effort to create a modern understanding of Malcolm, right? Malcolm is a social democrat. Malcolm, who towards the end of his life had embraced the American nation state, who had embraced the process of democracy, who was no longer talking about insurrection or uprisings and so on. So just writing this book, it's really quite striking to see how black culture has become the calling card of America nowadays, of late American hegemony, to use an academic term.
Michael, what are some of the dangers in those distortions that are laid out by the State Department? Why is it important that we here be so aware of them, pay close attention to what is being used or misused in Malcolm's image?
I have another point, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just remembered. One of the reasons, actually, just in terms of American hegemony and the appeal of Malcolm, one of the reasons that Malcolm X is so appealing and the Black Freedom Movement is so appealing is that with the end of the Cold War, you don't really have a narrative of social justice, right? In terms with the end of communism and socialism, if you're a young man or woman growing up in Marseille or Bogota and you're a minority, where do you go if you're interested in racial justice, right? What are the left movements? What are the progressive movements that you can gravitate to, right, at an international level, right? For many, if you look at the political landscape, which is tilted towards the right internationally, the Black Freedom Movement fills a void. It fills a political void, right? And it is very well disseminated, distributed around the world through music, right? So Du Bois says this, Albert Murray says this, James Baldwin, that is Black history, the Black struggle is disseminated around the world through music. And so you get kids from Ecuador and Bolivia to Egypt, who begin to adapt the repertoire as the symbolic capital of the Black Freedom Movement, right? Policymakers are aware of this, and so they're trying to control this, right? Trying to tinker a little bit with this message. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's an excellent point.
Very important.
And what's interesting, I don't know what it makes me think about, and since we're in this region, the pitch battle recently with HB2, I mean, this is off topic, but related to what you just said, down in North Carolina, and certain of black figures upset that the political and symbolic capital of black freedom struggles would be appropriated by gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual people as if none of them could be black. But it's the same argument in reverse, some would say, because how dare you then appropriate this movement for the expression of resistance to oppression because of sexual orientation in a way that has been pioneered by those who have been struggling with issues of race. It just occurred to me, given your brilliant analysis. But I think, the dangers always are that we don't pay attention to how these figures take root in the fertile soil of many young people's imaginations, and therefore tend to prescribe to them what the appropriate uses are, hinged upon our own older styles and forms of interpretation about what's appropriate. Right. So it's that same old, old man beating up on the young man, old woman beating up on the young woman kind of impulse there, and the scolding that takes place in terms of what our generation did or what we did, and we were more radical and we were closer to a figure like a Malcolm X, closer to the logic that motivated him closer to a sense of the times that shaped him. And what we end up doing, I think, is undermining the ability and the durability of a figure like Malcolm. Because what Hisham's work does is remind us of just how, when I talked about the literary future that Malcolm possessed, just how continually relevant a figure like Malcolm is, because he is so adaptable in the best sense of that word to the plight and predicament of people who are struggling now for self-determination, for self-expression, and the distributive mechanisms that Hisham is speaking about vis-a-vis the pop culture, whether it's jazz or whether it's hip-hop. And some people rule out the possibility that hip-hop itself could ever be a form of anything progressive, because they witness what goes on in mainstream American capital with the appropriation, symbolically and literally, of the sounds of blackness and the means by which that insurrection is perpetuated overseas, outside of America, is at once the same mechanism that reinforces a certain kind of capitalist accumulation and an uncritical celebration of materialism here. So people are like, well, damn, it can't be the same thing, and it can't be the same means by which this occurs. So I would say some of the warning signs against those of us who would be too precious in terms of what is appropriate and proper in terms of how we should address it. Now, the warnings, but more broadly, about the dangers, I should say, not warnings. The dangers more broadly, of course, might be that the very radical possibilities that Malcolm unleashes will be too quickly commodified or immediately absorbed into a pre-existing language of revolution that doesn't pay heed and attention to the intimate organic forms under which those particular ideas change. For instance, to take an example that we might be able to relate to in America, like the big argument with Bernie Sanders and the like, and progressive identities and progressive politics now. And one of the lessons that feminists have taught us, especially in regard to Marxism, and other people of color in regard to it as well, is that you got to pay attention to the cultural forms that mitigate a complete capitulation to a narrow, class-based understanding of what that inequality is, as if that somehow obliterates all other forms of suffering simultaneously, or absorbs them under this and subsumes them under this larger rubric called class, as opposed to the ways in which the iterations of gender and sexual orientation and race are somehow eradicated, ironically and paradoxically, under the impetus of a progressive ideology. So I say all that to say that in the same way, Malcolm gets deployed, I think, in quite interesting and provocative fashion by folk that we didn't ordinarily think could appropriate him, think about him, use him, find him useful as the currency through which they express, and this is where Hisham's work, I think, comes in especially notably, where it becomes access to, purchase of, and expressions about the very freedoms that people seek, and Malcolm's body becomes a convenient translation, a shorthand, and a metaphor all at once of what those possibilities are. And for us to circumvent that, for us to have some kind of high-minded political purity and ideological, if you will, adherence to a narrow interpretation of that, it means that we miss out on a lot of potential that is there in those kind of thoughts of young people the world over.
I'd like to tie in something you just spoke about that's related to an earlier point that was made by both of you in terms of the dissemination of black revolutionary struggle through music internationally. And just a moment ago, Michael, you were speaking about paying close attention to the reduction of pop culture forms that just simply re-articulate or re-inscribe capital. So remarkably, miraculously, jazz tradition, this has never happened to jazz tradition. Jazz, for whatever reasons, largely I would think probably because of the originality of the intellects of the masters as improvisers, has resisted this kind of pop cultural reduction, this kind of re-articulation of capitalist ethics. Malcolm X, as we know, adored jazz. He was very intimate with jazz music. In fact, he was a drummer himself, and he performed and was also, as we know, a man who had mastered many forms of jazz dance. Can we explore that a bit here? Because I think it's very important to understand fully what it is that both of you mean when you talk about the dissemination of black revolutionary struggle through the music. We know from the study of our history that during the period in which our literacy was punishable by death, that much of the story, if you like, and retention from our origins was sublimated to the music and later would find its way into text, which Ishmael Reed writes so eloquently about in Mumbo Jumbo and talking about just grew. But with those thoughts in mind, could I hear from you gentlemen on this relationship between jazz as a form of resistance and how Malcolm is so intimately woven into the fabric of that music especially?
Malcolm and jazz. I've been going through Malcolm's papers at the Schomburg, and what's delightful about looking through his letters and his diary and so on are the mentions, sort of the shout-outs that he gives to different musicians, right? So when he was young, as a shoeshine boy in Boston, right, he used to go to Boston Ballroom. He met Count Basie, very proudly said, I met Count Basie, I met Lionel Hampton. He was a dancer, right? His name on stage was Jack Carlton, right? In honor of his brother. But then in prison, he becomes Muslim, right? And he becomes ambivalent. So he writes a letter talking about the comforting message of jazz and how much I love Dina Washington. But he says, it also reminds me of my sinful past. So he starts struggling with jazz, with what music means, right? And he gives a talk, he gives a lecture somewhere, I think it was in Oxford, which I excerpt, where he says, black people have not been allowed into a number of realms. The only realm that they have not been excluded from is music, and they have mastered it. Right? So he realizes, right? And then you look at him when he travels through Africa, Ghana, Kenya, and so on. He goes to a number of the jazz places, jazz spots. In Ghana, he and Maya Angelou go to a cultural center to listen to High Life. Right, the Ghanaian nationalist music, which grows out of an interaction with African American music. Right, he's sitting there. He refuses to dance, but he takes it in. Right, and he sort of concludes that music for emancipation is permissible. Right. There's a field of study that's opening up now. James Brent Turner at Oklahoma is writing a book on Malcolm and jazz. Right, and the argument here is that the influence of the big bands, 1940s big band sounds that he was exposed to, that he absorbed, its influence on his speaking style, on the cadences of his speech, right? And then of course his influence on jazz musicians.
That's right.
Amir Baraka would write about the influence of Malcolm on John Coltrane, right? So that's what's going on. And then, of course, Malcolm is traveling around the world at the same time that the State Department launches the jazz ambassadors, the jazz tours as a way to counter Soviet propaganda about American racialism, right? So the Soviet Union's propaganda in the late 50s tended to focus on what's going on in the Deep South, Emmett Till, and so on. And so Adam Clayton Powell says we need to counter this by sending abroad integrated jazz bands led by Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong. And jazz is supposed to represent American inclusiveness, American democracy in its extemporaneous improvisational quality and so on, right? And Malcolm in his diary says, everywhere I go, I try to puncture a hole in that image. Right? And so it brings us back to sort of ironic that today he's part of a diplomatic arsenal.
Yeah. Right? Yeah.
This is where, again, your student becomes your professor. That's so brilliant. But you know, I'm a bit more critical, or at least skeptical, of Malcolm vis-a-vis this, because, see, this is the mode where when folk get converted, the devil gets all the best beats. And now this is in Christianity, Islam, Jehovah's Witness. Look, Prince invited a couple of us to the Paisley Park, and he had seen me on TV, and he says, you know, he said some very complimentary things about my politics, and that's why he wanted to talk to me, but he was disturbed, Prince, by the fact that I was supporting gay and lesbian and transgendered and bisexual people. And I said, wow, for real? You know, dirty mind, I'm thinking, you know, androgyny, and he's now converted. He's you know, now you're Prince of all religions, right? He and Michael Jackson, born in 1958, right? Jackson's born into Jehovah's Witness, Prince into what one would consider a profligate renunciation of every spiritual principle that might be articulated, even though he was obsessed with the spirit from the beginning, I think. And then Jackson at the end has to issue disclaimers on, you know, Thriller, given his faith, and he's moving away from the hegemony of a certain kind of spiritual orbit, and Prince is now entering near the last phase of his life into the very thing from which Jackson had somehow, in some ways, escaped, or at least departed. I don't want to say escaped, departed. So I find it problematic because the brilliance of Malcolm, right? And let me, the Prince story, he's arguing me about that. And then I asked him straight up, I said, are you telling me that all the music you made before you were converted is like devil's music? It's like not enlightened? And he was basically like, yeah. I was like, dude, I disagree. I'm arguing with Prince about his own music. Like, I'm crazy, right? Like, no, slow down, hold on. I said, signs of the times? Are you kidding? I said, God was speaking to you and you didn't even know it. Just like God isn't necessarily speaking to you once you get converted. And I think one of the real tensions in Malcolm, right, the irony of being used both in Beyonce, where his complicated understanding of women, we can put it that way, as well as now, his skepticism about jazz, I liked it better when you weren't converted. Because you were open to, yes, the profligate tendencies that had to be curbed, that religion stands in for, as a way to not only salve the wound of a secular conscience, but also to, in one sense, transform, metanoia, do an about-face of conversion within the major religions of the West, at least, and some in the East. I think that it militates against the very radical idealism and romantic political energy that Malcolm manifests on the black nationalist political side, is undermining the improvisational character, right, of his analysis because of his deference to a religious sensibility. And so Malcolm in jazz is as much a story of a counterpoint as it is an engagement, an pas de deux, so to speak, right? To mix metaphors, dance and jazz, but he was a great dancer. And I think it's all the music is superior to the politics at that level. The music is superior because the very form itself is a reminder of not only the ramshackle character of democracy. You see Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray and Stanley Crouch and when Marcel is using this as an argument, as a substitute argument for democracy, all of which are very compelling, but even especially, it is the very metaphoricity of blackness itself. The improvisational character of blackness that can never be reduced to any particular religious or theological drama or schema of explanation. And here I think Malcolm is to be challenged, as any figure is to be challenged, like Prince, who in deference to a religious narrative that may indeed perform a salvific purpose for their lives, certainly for Malcolm and certainly for Prince, also works against the very openness to musical forms that might be said to complement the politics that they so brilliantly and improvisationally articulate. I just think that there's tension and tremendous conflict there that at least has to be acknowledged. But that's just what I think off to, just thinking about it. But I'd like to see what Hisham, because he's so much more smarter about that. I'd just like to know what he thinks about that.
Yeah.
I agree.
Oh.
No, obviously there's a tension. It's really, it's incredible the role of music. I've been looking at the role of music in disseminating politics, but also in sparking religious movements. Right? Hip hop, well, in the 70s it was reggae. Reggae would inspire Rastafarianism around the world, right? People would embrace Rastafarianism. Bob Marley dies, hip hop emerges, and then hip hop becomes a way to disseminate African American religion, particularly African American Islam, right? And then you get people being exposed to 5%er Islam and Nation of Islam and so on around the world, right? And then you get other people, American hip hop artists. Think of Napoleon, who was part of Tupac's crew, right? Who would actually abandon religion, would abandon music because of a new conversion, right? So the music can take you in any particular direction, right? And just in terms of, I think often of the movements that Malcolm inspired and the counter movements that he inspired, right? Okay. So he would inspire the Black Power movement. We don't often talk about he also inspired Black liberation theology. Right. His critiques of Christianity would cause a crisis of faith in James Cone. That's right. It would cause James Cone to write his book on liberation and so on. Malcolm would prompt all kinds of ferment within the Islamic world as well. That's right. Marable says today Malcolm is really a bridge. If anything, today he's a bridge between the West and the Islamic world. What kind of bridge we can debate, but the debates taking place in Africa and the Middle East and South Asia about Malcolm, right? About his what kind of cultural influences he absorbed, religious influences. Marable in the book says Malcolm may have been inspired by Shiism. Well, that sentence caused a furor. It's unleashed an entire field of debate, right? A field of study, right? That's right. And a lot of it, again, is through music, hence the contradiction, right? It's the music that disseminates and sparks these debates.
Well, before we move forward to the question and answer period, I just want to, again, extend my thanks to the two of you for being so generous with your time and coming out to the Oakland Book Festival to share your thoughts and ideas with us.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure there's a great many of you who have questions. So this young lady will be walking the mic.
Thank you. Thank you both. Assalamu alaikum. I have a couple questions. I have no time, so I'm not going to ask all of them. But I first want to just make a comment, observation. Just thinking about the contested legacy of Malcolm X. As you were speaking, I recalled someone from Al-Qaeda calling him Uncle Tom. And then I thought about Eric Holder upon transitioning out, encouraging people to read his autobiography. And so amongst other things that that popped in my mind. That was one thing or two things. My two questions I want to ask, speaking on the legacy of Malcolm X, I was waiting for y'all to talk about his influence on encouraging people to embrace Islam or spirituality, and you did kind of talk about it in the context of this conflict around music, but I don't know if there's anything beyond that conflict you would add. And then the second question is just related to the need sort of articulated around having a moderate hip-hop or more so moderate Malcolm, and to what extent does the work by Manning Marable do that? Because there was a huge critique of it in the live reinvention by Professor Burrell and Paul.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna be real quick. Let the real man set up and do the popcorn, as James Brown would say. Yeah, in regard to the first, that's a great point. When I think about not simply because they're related, the moderate Muslim identity that Malcolm would unleash, but it cannot be denied in regard to Islam that nobody can listen to and engage Malcolm X and think that he's doing anything except bringing the ferocity of the ferocity of a critical intelligence to bear upon social injustice and the beauty of a spiritual intensity to bear upon suffering. And when I think of Ossie Davis's magnificent eulogy for him. What did you see in Malcolm but beauty and power and love and struggle against oppression? So I think in other words, it's an incredibly powerful confirmation of the redemptive value of Islam and what it might mean to follow it. I know that Hisham would have much more to say. In regard to the second point you were making,
Yeah, I was asking about moderate hip hop.
Yeah. Yeah, see, I happen to think that Manning Marable helped radicalize our understanding of Malcolm X and therefore appropriated the radical dimensions of Malcolm. It's not a moderate, it's moderate. I read these books, the live reinvention and so on, and there's some very provocative essays. But I think the ideological axe to grind against Manning Marable revealed some of the deficit of critical analysis and thinking, because at this level, Malcolm became a substitute and iconic figure that had been elevated to such a point that he was incapable of critical analysis or the very humanization that he insisted upon. The humanizing impulse, not the moderating impulse, the humanizing impulse, suggesting Malcolm vis-a-vis other kind of touchstones of gender, but especially sexual in nature, that people find it impossible to fathom. And I think that the bravery and courage of Manning Marable was to give us not a moderate Malcolm X, but a humane Malcolm X that I think will last far longer and be of far more use than other versions of Malcolm that have been generated. Let's just sit in. But here's Sean.
You want me to answer that? Yeah, very quickly. I'll just say what Marable was trying to do. Marable was sort of a 1960s Pan-Africanist, right? He studied in East Africa. He lived in Tanzania. He lived in Kenya. And he was fascinated by the Malcolmania, if you will, of the early 90s. What I remember him talking about is that since the mid-90s, since the late 90s until today, where's the black internationalist spirit that he grew up with, right? He knew that there's a deep love for Malcolm X within the black community, right? And just to return to Ta-Nehisi, I think Ta-Nehisi's book, I think the format is Baldwin, but Ta-Nehisi's actually a Malcolmite, right? If you look at his perspective, he writes about as a teenager, he'd walk around listening to the Ballad or the Bullet. Right. He rejects some of the warm optimism of the civil rights movement. He says the arc of history bends towards chaos, right? That's his claim. You're still seeing quite a bit of interest in Malcolm. It's out there. There's a love for Malcolm out there. And what Marable was trying to do, right, he was hoping this book would help reignite black internationalism. Right? So he's not moderating Malcolm. He's presenting Malcolm as someone who, towards the end of his life, realized that politics should be channeled towards the state. right? Internationalism is very helpful, right? Forging solidarities across borders can help galvanize movements domestically. You should seek support from elsewhere. You should go to international institutions. But towards the end of his life, he was talking about voting, right? Using the vote like a bullet, so to speak. So that's what I believe. That's what I believe Marvel was trying to do, right? And I mean, some of the critique, some of the criticism is from people who saw. I think the criticism was actually generational, right? I remember your debate with Amiri Barak on Democracy Now. It was the elders debating. Really, it was debates, holdovers of debates from the '60s and '70s, if you will, right? I'll leave it there.
Yeah. But that's interesting about Ta-Nehisi too, to even bolster your claim, because remember, The Fire Next Time, besides the letter from a region of my mind, the opening form, which he took as the entire form of his book, that was only Baldwin's opening few pages, but the rest of that was about engaging with the Nation of Islam, and so it's wholly appropriate that Baldwinian resurrection is also in part a Malcolm X-centered one as well. I think it's a great point.
My question is this, and I'll preface it with a comment, because you were talking about music. It seems like there was a little skipping of an important moment in which I think there was a handing off of one genre and maybe one generation to the next. And I'm talking about late 60s, early 70s. If you're in New York City, you hear Malcolm being played over jazz music, right? My cousin would play Malcolm. You would hear his voice continuously. And in the early days of hip-hop, I'm talking about the mid-'70s, you hear Malcolm in the parks being played over breakbeats. And the interesting thing is that his speeches that most people got the records from was on Paul Winley Records, which put out early breakbeat records. So you would go down to Harlem, 125th, and you would get these breakbeats, and then right alongside on the wall, there would be these various speeches by Malcolm that you would also get, and people would rock them in the parks. The other interesting thing is that many of the early hip-hop jams were at the Audubon Ballroom. Grandmaster Flash and all these people were talking about the 70s before. Most people were going to the Audubon Ballroom, and that's where these early hip-hop gigs were going on. Now, I'm not sure if people knew the full impact of Malcolm and what that meant in the way that we're discussing it today, but I would argue that he had a strong presence in the early 70s going into the 80s, which is why you have a Keith LeBlanc doing his record. It wasn't that it came out the blue, it was that Malcolm's voice was heard for a very long time amongst the hip-hoppers, to the point that he was on the cover of The Source because he was sampled so much. Now, I don't know where things are now, but I definitely would like to get your comment on that, because it seems like that's missed, that this organic exchange of information, Malcolm's presence, way before radio or anything, is something that's going on, at least in New York, and becomes his currency, as you're pointing out, that allows his message to get all around the world into multiple generations of people.
No, you're absolutely right. The earliest references started in early 70s with Africa Bambaataa. I absolutely agree with you. And then Keith LeBlanc and others pick it up in 1983, and in the 90s, we know what happened, and then it goes global in the mid-90s. Yeah, so I agree with you.
But I'm just saying that his presence was always, like you heard Malcolm, forget Bambaataa, you just heard Malcolm in the parks. If you go to New York, the way he was on the street corner, you would hear his speeches being rocked at a park, and I think that shouldn't be lost. That maybe it's older generations, or maybe it's a sense of power, but this was happening organically.
It's ongoing to this day. Malcolm is still the sonic backdrop. You know.
And I think, look, he's the ultimate underground figure. I mean, vis-a-vis the civil rights movement, that is the underground. Malcolm X is the underground in the sense of the pitched battle, ideologically speaking, between two opposed viewpoints within that culture, and the way in which Malcolm is forced to occupy a certain space makes perfect sense as to why he would then be not only the sonic backdrop for the development and evolution of that consciousness, but be seen as consciously the basis for a counter-revolution, a counter-dominant rhetoric that is being accessed by these young people, because his voice is there, his style is there. The point you made earlier about the relationship, which is a fascinating one, between even earlier jazz music and his style of speech. I think that's fascinating to me in terms of the big band and in terms of what was going on, because given later on what happens in jazz between big band and then what happens with bebop, and the kind of tensions that are there. But I'll say all that to say, because Malcolm, I think, still signified for so many people the pristine and pure expression of an underground aesthetic or a prefigured aesthetic for hip-hop before it goes commercial, where to retain his voice is to retain that authenticity. But I think your point is just so well taken.
We have time for one more question. Cecil Brown?
I want to thank Michael for coming out and visiting us.
Oh, yeah.
This is from Cecil Brown.
Cecil Brown.
Intellectual once said that we like our heroes dead. And one of the reasons why people are attracted to Malcolm is because they can reinterpret him because he's not here. The question is what we were saying when he was here. And the other thing is that I think, Justin, you're wrong that black people always had international impact in the whole world from the time of slavery. They invented the idea of freedom. So if you go to Europe in the 60s, you heard jazz. In Copenhagen and wherever I was in Europe at that time, there was jazz. Now we have hip-hop. But the same principle worked. There's an oral tradition that's translated through various mediums. Right? Now we have electronics. So you're going to hear. You heard it when it's acoustic. So it's not the question of now we can reinterpret and get some insight into Malcolm. The question is, we like our heroes when they're dead and gone. Then we can do our work. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Michael, for being here, man.
Brother Brown, the man. Can't wait for that James Baldwin memoir you got coming out, man. That's the man right there. Y'all do know that, all right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Where are we time-wise?
We have like 3 more minutes.
Oh, great. Yeah, please. Absolutely. Absolutely. No.
Just a quick question. You mentioned earlier about how a lot of different struggles and movements of resistance seem to borrow Malcolm's image. It's an image of convenience you mentioned. You talked a lot about appropriating his image for a lot of different reasons that kind of maybe are not in line with what he was struggling against or what he was fighting against or what he was fighting for. But my question is, in your opinion, because you mentioned a lot of different struggles that use his image, but what do you feel is appropriate uses of Malcolm's image or words or writings or works in those international struggles? Because my question is, obviously, he's such an iconic, popular figure and people like to gather behind him, but what would you feel is or what construct would you use to identify what's an appropriate usage of his image and his works today?
That's to me. Look, I cringe when I see when I'm in Europe and I see neo-Nazi hip-hop, for example. Right? Ultra-right, anti-immigrant movements that appropriate hip-hop, obviously, because it's a useful way to disseminate. It's a massively compelling art form that can reach youth elsewhere across borders, from city to city, and so on. The message that I would like conveyed that when people appropriate Malcolm is the one that Du Bois speaks about and so on. It's one of solid social solidarity. It's one of anti-racism. It's one of anti-militarism. And nowadays one of gender equality. But I realize you can't copyright Malcolm. You can't impose a particular interpretation that he's going to be a contested figure around the world, right? I mean, in the book I spent some time in a favela outside of Sao Paulo. Belo Horizonte, San Bernardo do Campo, outside of Sao Paulo, and there's a group that's emerged that's called Posse Hausa, right? And they're trying to create a Black Power movement using hip hop, right, to counter the funkeiros, the funk, which is, rather excessive in Brazil, right? So they're trying to use hip hop to build community, to organize, to mobilize. And Honor Elamin, who's the head of this organization, he tells me, I got my political education through hip hop, through Chuck D. I heard about Malcolm, and through Malcolm, it exposed me, it opened up an entire world to me, right? And he says here in Brazil, hip hop has a moral advantage over all other music. Is that the case in America where you live, right? I'll leave that to you. Right? The answer, I'll leave that to you. But the debate is going to continue, obviously.
And that is powerful. vis-a-vis especially neo-Nazi. But getting back to our brother's point earlier, the whole argument with Manning was about the degree to which Malcolm could be deployed for even more liberating potential, and people want to circumvent that, want to circumscribe that, want to narrowly draw it with a kind of purity that I think is antithetical ultimately to the improvisational character of Malcolm's social critique, and borrows from, I think, earlier moments of resistance to a more complicated and more, if you will, nuanced interpretation of what that freedom might look like. So I'm not just as afraid as what I see going on there on the right side of the aisle, but I'm certainly cautious and concerned and skeptical about the appropriations of the true believers and those who would defend a narrow conception of his authenticity against those who would use it for even more liberating possibilities. I just think that's problematic too. What is? What's that down there? Who's that? Is that part of the festival? Well, they're getting down there, bro. Thank you, man.